each panelist has 10 minutes. And what we've decided to do is not use too many slides, just talk essentially, around a dilemma that they have with action learning. They'll explain this dilemma and tell you how it ties to the whole notion of innovative leaders and so on. And they will then talk for 10 minutes. I will cut them off exactly at 10, and they know this. So they've agreed to these rules of engagement. And then we'll have at least half an hour for discussion at the very end, because I'm sure you'd like to have a lot of interaction, which is the purpose. We're going to go in order as well of the program. So I'm going to ask Kathy to start us off. Thank you.
There's a little brochure that's at the end of each of the rows. I'm not actually going to talk to it, but it gives you a little idea about the program that I'm talking about. I mean, in fact, we don't think of it as a program, but it's actually a part of an overall approach. It's an interesting concept to talk about dilemma, because that is at the heart of what we are trying to solve for ourselves today. But I think it's important that I give you just a little bit of background so you understand why the dilemma is what it is. So I work for a global healthcare company called Covidien, which some of you may have known in a past life as Tyco Healthcare, and way, way, way back when we were actually the Kendall products, which you probably have in your household. Gauze and Band-Aids and other things. So it's a company that's been around a long time, but has grown almost exclusively by acquisition. So we have done over 70 acquisitions in the lifetime of our company, and primarily operated as a holding company. It's an important clue here about our dilemma. And we worked as a holding company under Dennis Kozlowski, another important clue to our dilemma. Do any of you know who that is? Yeah, so the CEO of Tyco, who got fired and sent to prison because he bought $6,000 shower curtains with Tyco's money. And part of our culture is defined by that very event, because it drove us to become extraordinarily careful and controlling about everything. And we raised our approval levels all the way up. So in some cases, even administrative assistants have to be approved by the SVP of HR and the CEO. Gives you a little bit of an idea about sort of the way we've built our culture. So we are a very careful, incredibly risk-averse, tremendously action-oriented group of people who have a very difficult time deciding for ourselves what to do. So if you think about that in the context of this very open, let's talk, let's reflect, and let's ask questions, on the one hand, it's very much what we need to do. On the other hand, it's very much not what we want to do. So this reflection notion, in one of the programs we ran, we started to do a dialogue in the beginning of each of the days that we started. And one of the participants came up afterwards and said, this is like what I do with my kids in kindergarten. So there was a lot of resistance. And it came out in all kinds of ways, some of it not so nice and not so pretty. The very first one, the participant said, we felt like lab rats. Felt like the coaches were just watching us and looking at us and not helping us in any way. The struggle for me is we are an organization. We just completed our strat plan for 2016, and one of the elements of our strategic plan is developing global leaders. One of the other elements is innovation. And what we know clearly, right up to the board of directors, is our leaders need to think differently. So how do you get leaders to think differently? What are those most important tools that drive that? Certainly one of the things we do, because we also need to think globally, is we go overseas and we force them into the environment. So their projects, they need to go out and then need to meet with customers, clients. In Taiwan, one team went to an innovation institute and just had an absolute breakthrough in terms of thinking about their project. So we do try to do that kind of immersion work with them, but we did need them to think differently. We do need them to ask questions instead of having answers. They can't always be the solution providers. And therefore, action learning feels like just the right fit. But getting it to fit, when we also have an organization that, when McKinsey helped us with the spin, said, we have leaders who have a 70% gap, yes, 70% gap in their knowledge to be leaders at the same level as leaders in other companies. So our leaders didn't have some of the very basics. My analogy is we were in mothballs for 20 years. We didn't invite consultants in. We didn't look outside at best practices. We did it ourselves. We're an organization of engineers. If it needed fixing, we were going to fix it. We were an organization that was very tight on money because it all went up to the mothership. We didn't have money to spend on those kinds of things. We never developed our people. We acquired all of our people, and we decided who we kept and who we got rid of, and they came with whatever expertise they needed. We did not develop them. So none of that rigor around actually learning for myself, growing, personal development is built into our culture. And yet we needed people to learn equal to or faster than the rate of change. Because the healthcare market, if any of you have been paying any attention, is changing dramatically out there. It's not just the US healthcare reform, it's China, it's India, it's Brazil. There's dramatic intervention by governments around the world in figuring out, so what is trying to do with that many people? And they don't provide healthcare, but they need to provide healthcare. So what do they do about that? So the world is changing. The people we talk to figure out what our products should be are completely different than they used to be. So action learning makes sense. So it's trying to figure that out with giving them some of the fundamentals around business acumen, strategy, working in a global world, and leadership. So trying to put all of that in one place, in one bucket, because they, after all, are all connected. They're all about the global innovative leader. And innovation is our primary driver for our growth for the future. The program makes sense, but it isn't easy. It isn't easy for the program managers, the coaches, or the participants who fight valiantly against sitting and reflecting, learning how to ask questions, working and focusing on themselves, as well as thinking about the projects very differently from OpEx, which is what our culture is all about.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Valerie Linkeman. I'm thrilled to be here and to be immersed in learning with all of you today. I'm a retired federal employee. I spent my career in the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization that really does need to learn to be ahead of what's going on in the rest of the world so we can develop intelligent policies and approaches with our foreign partners. My comments today are informed by my experience not only as an internal consultant and line manager from CIA. I worked in intelligence for about 10 years and then shifted my career into the world of learning and development when I realized our managers really need more development. So I did that for 20 years, and now I'm working privately as an independent coach and consultant. One of my great collaborators and mentors is here today, Chuck Appleby. We have conspired together to bring action learning into CIA. I'm very proud of that. And so since I retired, I'm experimenting all the time with action learning. I've had the opportunity to work with organizations that bring people together. It's always in the leader development context, but bring managers together to solve their individual leadership challenges, as Yuri spoke to earlier today, and also work with organizations that bring folks together to solve those organizational business challenges. I'm also working with a program that is doing both, and that's been an interesting experience. I'm dabbling in some virtual action learning where we do it on the phone, so it's just this continual process of trial, error, and experimentation. The question that I am seized with is this one: how can we realize the transformational potential of action learning? That's what brings me to this work. I've done a lot of things in the world of leadership development over my career, and I've always been in search of what's the methodology, what can we bring together that will facilitate personal transformation and organizational transformation at the same time. My dream for my work today is to bring action learning into a context where we're working across boundaries in society to solve really tough systemic problems, irrespective of boundaries and borders and polarization. I live in Washington, D.C. I know the world of polarization pretty well. So that's my dilemma. In preparing my thoughts today, I really have been trying to boil down my learning like a good chef, trying to come up with the wonderful stock that's the basis of all the great dishes you create. I was trying to distill out the essences of what makes action learning work. When can we see the magic that it holds the potential for? And a couple things came to mind. Number one, the idea of relationship. I think as program managers, coaches, whatever our role is in supporting action learning in organizations, one of the things we really have to tend to is giving participants and everybody in the action learning community in the organization or whatever, whether it's the sponsor, the champion, the executives, the team members, the coaches, We have to give them an opportunity to develop human relationships. I work in organizations that, where people have a lot of fear. I'll just tell you one quick story. I'm working with a team that has been at it for months on an organizational problem. And one of their major discoveries is that their executive team doesn't know anything about IT systems acquisition and management. They don't know anything about it. They don't know how the organization does it. All they know is that it's ineffective, and the team's supposed to solve this problem. And so the team spent a good deal of time, once they made this discovery that their executives need to be educated about IT, they spent a good deal of time debating on whether or not they could say our executives need education. And so like this assumption that, the underlying assumption, executives are supposed to know everything. How can we tell our executives that maybe they don't? This was a risky proposition for these folks. And so we spent some time on that. And, what kind of culture are you in when you can't let your executives learn? So anyway, that's fear-based organizations. So back to relationship. If we can form close relationships with each other, we begin to realize that I'm not alone. I'm not the only one that doesn't understand IT systems. We're in it together. Why don't we solve it together? Our vulnerabilities come out, our humanness comes out, and we can begin to build trust and respect that Yuri talked about as being critical. Another key element I think that makes action learning work is when people have the opportunity to opt in. A lot of organizations in leadership development programs, they select their high potentials and they come to you and say, we got this great opportunity for you. And you know what? You may have things going on in your life or in your work and you just don't have the bandwidth right now. Action learning is not a trivial undertaking. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of juggling, and I think we really have to give people the opportunity to opt in and to know what they're opting into. Because otherwise you just see the stress level rise and it affects the outcomes and the relationships. The other thing is I use this image of the double helix to represent the process of learning and unlearning that's going on simultaneously when we're doing action learning. And so I think it's also very important that we create a context so that people who are on sets, teams, or whatever we want to call them, understand that part of their challenge is going to be to let go of the way we've always done it, or let go of their assumptions and maybe a little bit of their worldview, and be open to discovering other possibilities for innovation and for growth. Finally, I think one of the critical essences of action learning is an organization that supports the undertaking. And this is a big dilemma, because creating the expectations, I think my fellow panelists are going to talk a bit about this, creating the environment, educating all the players on what this beast of action learning is and what it requires is a really important part of it, really important. So if those are the critical things that we need to have to help realize the magic of it, how do we as coaches or program managers or consultants make sure those elements are in place? Like any good chef, creating this magical, Michelin 4-star menu, whatever, his or her success depends on that sous chef doing the chopping and washing and preparation in the kitchen. It's the preparation we do before we even bring the team together that is so important to success. And I think that we do the preparation, probably the easiest way, and Chuck has helped me learn this and see this work, is by letting people experience action learning before they jump into a program. So they understand the Revens-based elements: inquiry, reflection, trust, the idea of relationship and values underlying it. We have to really experience that before we jump in and spend a lot of money on it. The other thing that I'm committed to when I work with teams, particularly in organizations, is helping them develop strong teaming skills. Everybody in the world is on lots of teams today. In organizations, in our personal lives, teaming skills are really critical. And So in my work as a coach and my reflective questioning, I try to bring teams around to what are the teaming skills we need, and I found that it's not intuitive for people. So I'm starting now to orient teams early on with a common vocabulary around teaming skills. I use Team Coaching International's vocabulary on positivity and productivity skills. So when we reflect, we have something to hold that mirror up against. We have the common baseline. The other thing I notice is that we are often wedded to this idea of staying in the team for problem clarification and asking questions, asking powerful questions, but until people get out into the field, up close and personal with the stakeholder and the person actually living in the problem remains abstract. So I think we do teams and organizations and ourselves a disservice if we say you have to clarify the problem first. I see it as an iterative process where we ask a lot of powerful questions, we develop some hypotheses, we go out and test them and look for data, we come back and we ask some more questions. And it's just an iterative thing, and we're always open to that continual problem clarification. I also think organizations get under the gun time-wise, and they often skip the testing phase of action learning. And that's where the data comes out. Are our solutions actually going to work? So let's work with organizations so they do the testing, they get the data, they can feel more confident in what they're going forward with. Finally, the other thing I really try to focus on with action learning is how can we design the action learning programs and engagements in a way that builds learning organizations. We've got these rigid hierarchies. I really believe we can design action learning in a way that will leapfrog the hierarchy and blur the stovepipes and allow every person who participates in action learning to build social capital that will speed up their ability to do their day job, not just solve the problem they've been given on the team. I did that at CIA by bringing our problem owners together. We ran 3 concurrent teams, brought them together as a learning community. What are you learning? What are you struggling with? Getting them to try it on. Same thing with our internal coaches. So we were all communities of learners at the same time. I sit with a lot of questions about action learning, and I'll put them out to you because I know you have a lot of wisdom. How do we deal with the tyranny of not having enough time to do this important work? Reflecting takes time. We have to percolate ideas. We have to let worldviews that conflict with our own, we have to kind of hold them out there and let them sink in and try them on, and we can't just do that rapidly. I'm working mostly on multi-month action learning engagements. I'm curious who's doing anything with kind of intensive, shorter-term engagements. Like, are there models that would work better to allow all these things to happen in a different way where people aren't stressed out by their day jobs? The other thing, this is my personal dream I will put out because I think we share common values. That's why we're here. I imagine this possibility of using action learning to solve these complex problems that defy boundaries. I'll give you an example. Children in foster care, languishing in foster care. I get choked up when I think about it. How can we help children in foster care find permanent and loving homes? There's this huge system around children in foster care. Social workers, biological parents, foster parents, special service providers, educators, schools, social workers, advocates. Everybody cares about the issue or they wouldn't be doing it, right? But the system doesn't work so well. Imagine what could happen if we convened that system and we all entertained a powerful question around how can we help these children find permanent and loving homes. And we just saw what we could create together. That's my dream. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I'm Victoria Marsick, and I face a lot of dilemmas, as probably all of you do who work with action learning, which is why I love it so much. But the one I want to talk about today in particular is one that was motivated in a lot of ways by some of the things that, Yuri, you pointed out about how Reg got started with this whole process. And the fact that, that because of maybe his physics background or whatever as a physicist, that he says that, you shouldn't have learning coaches because they're part of the mix and they're going to make things. I'd never heard that explanation before, and it was really helpful to me to hear it. But in some ways, we're putting people in unnatural situations when we put them in action learning sets. As Peter Senge said last night, you don't do an action learning set with your buddies. You have very diverse people, as you pointed out. You want people with very different perspectives, which is especially interesting for and important for innovation. So it seems to me that the whole idea of action learning is an unnatural rather than a natural act. And yet it's based on this idea that we are all natural learners. And I often also wonder, and now we won't really be able to find out because Reg is not around anymore, but I asked myself the question about how different were the learners that he was working with than the learners that we're working with, because it has to be driven and appropriate to the people who are with us. You can't take people where they're not able to go. And so when we heard Peter Senge talk about the fact that we grew up in an industrial model. Now the kids grow up in an internet model, and that may be very different, at some point. But a lot of people didn't grow up to be self-directed learners. Reg's whole process is that it's driven by learner interests. And the learners that I've worked with, many of them, even at Teachers College, Columbia University, look at me and say, what am I supposed to learn? How many pages is it supposed to be? What am I going to be judged by? This whole performance mentality, et cetera. So it really is a very interesting situation that we find ourselves in. And I do remember very much being in a session that Lex ran in Florida early on with Reg, and Reg talked about his whole model, et cetera. And then I got up and I started talking about some of the things that we were doing around action learning, and he kind of looked at me with this withering look, and he said, oh, that academic, the P learning coming on board, et cetera. But, so it's kind of an interesting challenge. So my dilemma is, how do you support this unnatural act? How do you really provide enough structure and support without getting in the way, but recognizing that the people in the set get in the way too. They get in the way of themselves, they get in the way of other people, the organization gets in the way. And you can either say, oh, well, it should be ideal and then we shouldn't get in the way, or we should use it, it'll sort itself out. But in reality, we all know that kids on the playground sort things out too, and sometimes it doesn't end up so pretty. So, I'm not looking for pretty, and I'm not looking for tied bows and all the rest of it. But I try to think about, are there ways that we can support this so that some of the wisdom of what we've all learned is built into the process in some way. And so that's kind of one of the dilemmas that I and my colleagues, Judy, who's here, Lyle Yorks, other people, over time, kind of collectively, we've played with this notion of, can we support it? And Karen Watkins, with whom I do a lot of work, she came up with this idea of hang time in a glider. I wouldn't have the courage to do that, but I'm sure some people in the room have. The closest I've gotten is the one that you go to the beach, and they put you in the thing, and then the boat takes you out for about, I don't know how, I did it once. I'm glad I did it. I probably will never have the courage to do it again. But when you're up there, it's a little like, going up in a tall building and looking over everything. I love flying in airplanes for that reason, because you can see all this stuff out there. And so the idea of the structure, while I'd like to be able to scaffold it and form it, I'd also like it to be minimally structured. I would like it to be a situation where people can kind of move it forward on their own. So what would that look like? And that's kind of the dilemma we've been playing with. Picking up and using some of the tools that come to us through action learning, certainly a question-driven process. And if you think about action learning and a question-driven process, you don't have to say anything else. That's innovation. That's at the heart of innovation. We need a lot of new ideas, but we also, for innovation, need to develop the capacity to take it to market, to produce it, to get it out there. And that's a collaborative social process. And so how can we in fact create a structure where people can work together? We have to work together to make that happen. But that's driven by questions. And yet, as Peter Senge talked about last night and other people have talked about today, that drives deeper, gets people to ask fundamental questions, to be transformative in the way you think, so that in fact you can kind of come up with a new point of view about things. Because we know from cognitive science that when you have a strong point of view, what happens is the rational side of the brain shuts down, and the emotional side of the brain not only is active, it also gives you rewards for thinking in an accurate way. Drew Weston at Emory University has done a lot of work in that area. So how do we jolt people out of the perspective that they have without being too offensive? Because of course we have to be somewhat challenging, to create a situation where you're bumping up against unfamiliar situations and not feeling totally incompetent. in the process. Because if you feel incompetent, you're not going to be effective. But if you feel completely confident, you're probably also not going to be effective. So that's kind of what we're trying to do with action learning conversations. How's my time, Yuri? I mean, how many more minutes do I have left? 4. Okay, that's what I didn't ask the right question. So, it is this kind of idea of staying up in the air. The joy is in the work. You got to get to the details. But we bring the details into the process. And so we do this because, oh, by the way, another really interesting piece of information that I heard around this process is I'm marrying up the idea of action learning and the idea of conversation. And so this isn't an action learning intervention program, et cetera, but it's saying, as you were saying, are there ways that we can bring some of this more intensely in shorter periods of time to what we do on a regular basis without immersing people in a total program? And so the effort is to try to create a structure for conversations that people can have anywhere or anytime as they're addressing challenges that they're facing, whatever they might be in your personal life or in your work life. And the idea is that, when we get in a conversation, often what happens is we find ourselves defending. I use my husband as a good example. I come home with a challenge and he starts asking me questions, and before you know it, I can't think afresh because he's helping me solve the problem and I can't get outside of the problem. And so, so that's what happens. And yet when we can open that up, when we can create a structure to make it work differently, then maybe we can get in some new ideas. And so these are tools that people use in action learning all the time. It's not like I'm invented a whole lot of things. I think it's the looking at what works and trying to put them together in some way so that there's a process that drives it forward. And I know you do use the inquiry-driven process that a lot of people in England use, and we do too. But what we've tried to do is to systematize it a little bit so that people feel that they know how to do it. We find that I do a lot of work with principals, for example, and principals in schools, they are like managers in organizations. They are the managers of the schools. And so their business is not to ask questions. Their business is to solve problems. And so what do? They jump up the ladder of their inference, like we all do. We come in the situation, we see a few things, we know the solution, we do it, and then we've left out the process in between. So they ask questions, but the questions are more about what's the facts, ma'am, up to a certain point, and what do we do about them? And they leave out the part in between about how do we all see it differently? How can we think about it differently? And so we use, in our process, a framework called ORID, and I'm just going to share it really, really quickly, and then I know I'm going to finish my time. But it starts, as action learning often does, with a question. So we ask people to frame it as a question, to say, to think about that. And then we have a process of opening it up first with objective questions, because as we've been saying, it's very contextual. So if you don't know enough about the context, you ask questions that are somewhat not related. And that's where I think peer learning is so valuable in action learning. Because when we're in the same situation or a similar situation, we know that in a different way and we'll ask different kinds of questions. And then it goes to other kinds of questions that are more reflective questions, interpretive questions, hold off the decisional questions till later on. But then the process of, so what did I hear you say that I think you're making an assumption about? Or what would I assume if I were in your situation? And I use a format that's somewhat like My Dinner with Andre, for those of you who are older in the room and remember that movie, where you're kind of sitting there and you're the fly on the wall and you're listening in on what other people are seeing and hearing and thinking, which is very startling and upsetting to some people. Because although we are all doing it all the time, as Woody Allen shows us in his movies, we don't really think that other people see us, see that we can see what's going on. So it's startling to hear people talk out loud what they think you might be thinking about. And then that leads naturally to some reframing. We go around the room and say, so now how would I put your question based on all that I've heard? And that leads to allowing people to have some fresh insight. The one thing I would finish with is that it's very unnatural, because we do in fact ask that people who are the challenge holder, whoever that might be, and we're working on your question, that you don't try to answer back and just take it in, write it down, take it in. At the end of each step, we give people a little space to kind of say what you might want to say. Don't try to answer all those questions, respond to everything, but what might be new to you now that you've been hearing about that? So that is kind of how I've been working with my dilemma. I'm in the process of learning about it and would be very happy to hear from any of you about some of the things you've tried that worked to marry up the idea of action learning and some idea of more conversations embedded in the natural work environment. Okay?
Mm-hmm. Good morning, everyone. I'm Wanda Likovsky, and really happy to be here. You know, we had a set program, and then Yuri changed it all last night, so we've been asked to talk about dilemmas.
We did it together collaboratively.
We did it together. We did. I was part of this. So I'm going to be winging it a little bit. I guess there's a lovely image of a, I'm not sure what the scaffold is, but anyway. I think many of you heard some of what we do here from Peter Senge last night. So I have the pleasure and privilege of working with Peter on the course Leadership Lab, along with Sinead O'Flanagan and Jason Jay. And over the last 5 years, we've really, I think, done some really exciting and innovative things that have really helped to shift some of the ways of doing pedagogy at Sloan that have been part of a much larger program of action learning. We now have many labs that do really exciting things, really trying to make a difference both in the personal lives of the students as they really begin to change as they learn. So it's not just about learning textbook knowledge or solving problems. It's about learning about themselves and being really doing part of that transformation that Yuri talked about, but also really making a difference in the world. You know, we really reach out to hundreds of companies and really work with them, organizations of all types, corporations, NGOs, government agencies, as well as not-for-profits, working with them to really try and help them begin to learn and grow and develop in all sorts of ways. But the dilemma that we have lots of dilemmas, but the one I'm going to focus on this morning is that of expectations. One of the biggest issues we have is how to address, manage, and then deal with the very different kinds of expectations that both our students have as well as our host organizations have of what action learning is. Starting with the students, we get them in their second year. They've had a whole year of core courses in the MBA program, which are wonderful experiences for them, but it is about a very particular kind of learning. It's a pedagogy that takes place in these kinds of rooms, where students sit listening to the faculty present, whether it's PowerPoint presentations, lectures, or it's an interactive case discussion. But it's very much grounded in what happens in this kind of room. There are assignments and problem sets. Things are much more structured, much more predictable, much more linear. And then they come to L-Lab, or Leadership Lab as we call it. The room looks very different. In fact, the room we had our opening session in is one of the rooms we use for that class. We push all the tables aside. We just have a bunch of chairs in the middle of the room, and the students walk in. And you can just see them sort of not quite sure what this is. We don't use PowerPoints, except a few times when we have some real content to deliver. We use a lot of flip charts. We have them sit in circles in small groups. We hand out journals, and we say we want you to keep a journal, a learning journal where you reflect. This is completely strange, foreign territory for most of our students. So managing the expectations that, A, this is legitimate learning, that this has a role in the Sloan School, right? That this is very important, that you will learn something of value that will be beneficial to you, that there is something really worthwhile to invest in here, that it's long hours, spending time with host organizations full-time for 3 weeks in January. So getting their heads really shifted, so it's about changing their mental models, changing their assumptions about what learning is a huge dilemma for us, because we get them sort of highly socialized into learning as a very particular kind of thing. So we try to shake up those assumptions. We do all sorts of different exercises to do that. But nevertheless, there's always a little bit of a sense that you get from the students. Is this really, is this real? Is this real learning? Is this really going to be of value to me? Am I going to be able to just put that on my CV and get some benefit? Okay. The students that stick with us have a transformative experiences by and large, and it's wonderful. And we have fabulous testimony from them about they've really changed. They've embraced the notions that we share with them about the importance of looking at deeply held assumptions, about the regular and routine artifacts we use that really shape how we act, so measurement systems, technology systems. They really take all of that on board and they begin to question, surface question, and shift their habits of thought and habits of action. And it's really powerful. And they do it personally in a lot of their reflection papers that they write for the course. That's the other big difference. You want me to write a reflection paper, not a problem set? No, wait a minute. No, so reflection papers, so they do their own internal journey. But they also do it on their teams. So they work in teams of 4 or 5, as Peter described. And they really do personal work in those teams. So they begin to shift the team dynamic because they've already had a year of working in teams that have a very particular pattern. And we want to shift that. So where the team process is around inquiry, it's about check-in, it's about challenging, being up the ladder of inference, it's about questioning people's left-hand columns. It's really about having effective dialogue in those teams. So it's a very different process for them. But for those that do it, it's very powerful. And then those that can then carry that learning, that personal learning that they've had for the 3 months they've been here on campus, and take that to the host organization and talk to the host about the learning journey they've been on and how they want to help the host participate in that learning process. And when that works, it's, again, really powerful. So let me shift just a little bit, if I have time, to the expectations of hosts. So we work with a lot of companies, and they have all kinds of expectations of what might a team of MIT students do for them. So our brand really is wonderful and helps us, but it also hurts us, because it creates all sorts of expectations about expertise, about a certain kind of scientific, rigorous, rational knowledge that's going to be very analytical, very detached. And our students in Leadership Lab show up, and they have a very different set of skills and capacities that they want to share with the host organizations. So managing the expectation of a host that these will be collaborators, these students are going to work with you, collaborate with you, to try and help you think differently about the dilemma or the issue or the particular systemic, sustainable challenge that you're facing, is again quite a challenge for us to get the hosts to get their heads around, because they often expect students to come with a solution, to come with a deliverable at the end that is a PowerPoint deck that's going to solve some very particular technical problem. And that, of course, can be very helpful, and some of our labs do that kind of technical analytical work. But what we try and do in our lab is a little bit different, which is actually to help the capacity of the host to begin to question and surface their own habits of thought and habits of action. Because there's a deep belief here, and I think Peter touched on it yesterday, that change is about shifting habits. And so if we can get the organizations to begin to think about what are our deeply entrenched habits, then we can begin to make systemic change. But again, as I say, it's a real dilemma for them to kind of get into a mode that this isn't really about expert delivery of knowledge. It's about a kind of a process of working together. We use Ed Schein's lovely article, some of you are probably very familiar with it, that he makes the nice distinction between expert consulting and process consulting, and the real different values that both can bring and the benefits of both. And so we emphasize, we do, of course, both expert and process consulting in our projects, but we much more err on the side of process, where both our teams and our students work on their process, and then the learnings, the personal transformations they've been able to accomplish, they then can carry over and be wonderful advocates for in the host organization, because they've personally experienced some of that, and they can share the tools, the practices that have been useful for them, and try and bring that to the host. So when it works, it's wonderful. And our hosts are repeat customers. They love doing it with us. Where it doesn't work is where we have some real, this is the manager of the expectations, the students that show up for a class or two and then drop, because it's just not, it just doesn't connect for them. Or the host organizations who kind of didn't quite satisfy them at the end because they didn't get what they thought they might get. So how do we create the expectations about what this kind of action learning might be, both for the students and for our host organizations, is the things that we wrestle with. And I'd love to hear any thoughts or possible help you might offer on that. It'd be great.
You get a bonus. Could you explain a little bit more about what kind of projects they're involved in? Give us a more practical way.
Well, certainly. Let me quickly do that. So it's a whole range. The class is titled leadership lab, Leading Sustainable Systems. And we focus specifically on systemic change in the context of sustainability. But sustainability will be very broadly defined, so both environmental and economic as well as social sustainability. So our projects run the gamut from, for example, trying to build more sustainable practices in a supply chain. So we had a project with PepsiCo where the students spent a lot of time talking to potato farmers, trying to help understand what were the conditions on the ground in the potato farming. So how might PepsiCo, you might wonder, PepsiCo potato farming. PepsiCo owns Frito-Lay, so they're very concerned about potato farming. So how can PepsiCo help potato farmers become more sustainable in their practice so that the entire supply chain of the potato delivery through to the chips and the whole Frito-Lay process can be sustainable. So that's one example. Another example is the one Peter mentioned yesterday from NOS. This is a community down in Baja California, Mexico, where they're trying to create much more sustainable fishing. So we work with both the NGO, which is these marine biologists, but also then the community around them to try and engage the diverse stakeholders, which are both fishermen, fishers, but also local community of the actual the town, but also the government, local government, as well as the variety of companies, to try and actually build up a more sustainable fishing industry. They're trying to shift people away from their other kinds of industries that they might be more involved in. More examples? A flavor. I mean, they really run the gamut, right? From, as I say, the real supply chain kind of practices to product redesign to creating practices internally for how do you help an organization be more sustainable internally in terms of HR practices to try and build more resilience in the culture, for example. So they really do run the gamut. Okay, thank you.
So Wanda, let's start with you since it's fresh. One-line summary of your big dilemma that you'd like us to help you with.
Helping people understand the value of action learning and sort of deep personal transformation reflection when they are so well steeped into a culture of that learning is about textbook knowledge or it's about delivering expertise, it's transmission, it's a very arm's length kind of relationship, whether it's with our students or with our hosts.
Thank you. Valerie?
Mine is, how do we really realize that transformational potential of action learning at the individual level, the team and the organization, and even society?
Thanks.
The dilemma is to truly shift the way people think, at the same time trying to be sure that we're filling the sack with all of the things that they need, and some of them can appear to be contradictory. Lots of P-learning with this notion of asking questions and being able to reflect and think.
Okay, thank you.
And the dilemma is, how do you provide some structure and support to build the skills and capabilities so that people can really be effective learners, self-directed learners, without spoiling it, because you have too much structure and too much process and too much whatever. So it's that balance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll open it up to the floor in 1 second, but I take the privilege and the authority to ask the first question. It is said that when we talk about innovation, we're talking about transformation of products, services, and so on, and individuals. And I remember you asked me this question a long time ago, that you are very big into transformation because of Mesereau. And could you, that's the word I've heard a lot today. So could you explain what transformational actually means?
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of people, everybody in the room probably has a different understanding, and maybe each person can speak to it. But when we think about transformative learning, we think about being able to kind of get at fundamental shifts in one's thinking and mindsets and be able to kind of question and rethink them. There's also the idea of transformational learning, which is more like developmental change over time, that Bob Keegan does a lot of work with. So those, and then of course there's transformation in organizations, which is another thing entirely.
So we have a roadmap for our discussion. Okay, very good. So I'll open it up to anyone who'd like to ask questions or have a different point of view.
I guess I'm wondering whether or not the student cohorts that go out to the host businesses operate as a cohort in and of themselves, going out and studying an issue around a particular problem, or do they partner as a joint cohort with the hosts themselves, teaming up with leaders of a particular issue and forming kind of a set built both of students and of the business leaders themselves.
Harold, what's behind your question? Could you explain why you're asking the question?
Yeah, I was wondering, because one of the issues that we were dealing with were kind of managing expectations. And if the expectation is that the MIT students coming in from the lab are going to provide using their own set methodology around action learning to go out and study an issue and then deliver a result, that we haven't, I wonder if we've managed the expectation that it is a joint learning process, and that the learning occurs both from the student and from the business itself, and that is what might create the transformation.
So we try for the latter, right? So that's the aspiration, right? When we work, and Sinead does a lot of this, up front. In fact, probably now over the summer, she's spending a lot of time trying to get the host organizations, right, to work towards a project and to understand how important it is to have people in the host organization who will, in fact, we use the word host, right, to host them, but to be then colleagues with them, collaborators with them, so that there are people who will be working side by side, so that it really is a true collaboration. That is hard to manage, right? Because organizations don't always necessarily understand the value of that, or they sometimes say yes, yes, and then when the students get there, they aren't always followed through for lots of reasons. Some of it with the best intentions, but people get, we manage this in the summer. The students start the work in October, but they only get on site in January. People move on, people get promoted, things change, budgets shift. So it's not always something that we can fully manage. And those are the ones, it's very clear, the projects where there isn't that sort of willing, as you say, group that works along with our team of students, those are the ones that often get into more trouble.
It is very much a joint, theoretically, it's a joint learning process.
Exactly.
Everybody's learning
Yes.
as they go along.
That's
There's
right.
no status difference at all.
But you don't give them support once they are on site. They are left on their own.
Support from us at MIT? Oh no, these teams have 2 mentors dedicated to the team that work with them during their time here at Sloan. And then when they're on site, we have regular check-ins with them.
Same 2 mentors.
Same 2 mentors, yes, absolutely. So no, we don't at all just throw them to the, but we work with
Just
them.
clarification.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Thank you very much. And I think Kathy had a question.
Yeah, my name is Kristen McCormick, and I'm on the faculty at Boston University at the School of Management. And my question was sparked by Wanda's challenge around student expectations, but really it's a question that I'll throw it to anyone, which is how explicit are we or should we be with students or execs about learning in general, about adult learning? Not just this is action learning, this is how we do this, and this is why, but a broader question about learning. They come out of that first year at MIT like they do. We have the same issue. It's like, what is this stuff with the chairs and the circles and the reflection, and this can't be real learning. This is like some OB thing or whatever.
Soft stuff.
Yeah. You can feel it. And to what degree do we have, or does anyone have very explicit conversations about learning and what learning is and how people learn? And it's a question that I would throw out to anyone to see what have you done as it relates to either students or execs.
So I'll just quickly start, but then we do try in that first class where we get, the students to really share with them some of our philosophy around the learning, and that's why it's in a different kind of setup. It's why we have a very different sort of assumptions about what learning is. So we try and share that, but we are already talking to a highly selected group, the group that chose to show up in the classroom at that appointed hour. So we've already lost students who didn't even bother showing up because for whatever reason, this wasn't appealing. We also have this problem, many other business schools have, which is this is considered the soft skills, and they're not as important in their minds as the hard skills, right? The finance and the marketing, and so in terms of sort of priority of learning, we often are struggling with that prioritization. So we try to share our philosophy. It's not, so whether they hear it or not, or really fully understand that is uncertain.
Yeah, I think that it's part of that opting in, that they have to be able to opt into this learning experience, and we do have to be explicit about it. In my experience where, we have this big problem, we're going to parachute you in, if we don't have some type of launch event that gives them a taste of what this kind of learning is, it's then very strange to them when they get there, and they just take a long time to adapt. I think the other thing that's really powerful that we can do more of is to have all of the senior leaders, the problem owners, and the executives, when the teams are doing intermittent briefings with them or readouts on where they are, is that those people ask not only what's your progress on the project, but what are you learning? What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about this organization? What are you learning about working in a diverse team? What are you learning about our competition? What are you learning about the market? They create this expectation that we are all learners, and it's not just a one-shot deal. I think there's a heavy immersion up front works, but then it's continually reinforced.
I think that's all right, and it's all hard to do. So we talk about learning, but not a whole lot, because at least for us, that's, I did that already. To get the executives to ask about learning is really tough to do. To get them to model what that means by sharing some of their own experiences is one of the things we try to do. To get them to have conversations. So we've shifted the way they talk about their projects as conversations instead of what was much more evaluative. So there isn't a sitting back and giving you feedback on your project as there is asking questions. So we've tried to build the questioning capability into the sponsors and executives as well. And it's a journey. I mean, as we all know, it's a journey. I think the essence of this notion here is they have to experience it. So you have to somehow put them in something that's so uncomfortable that they have to deal with it, that they start to experience it, and then illuminate the experience in the peer conversations. To me, seems to be the most powerful way to. You can't explain it. It's very hard to do. Where's the words that really describe it? Putting them in the uncomfortable situation. It's a big piece.
Victoria, would you like to?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the things people have said, and I think part of it depends on the situation. So if we're working in organizations, then we usually do some framing up front that this is going to be different, because it is self-directed, and people like the idea, but when they are faced with the reality, they're very uncomfortable with it, So what are we going to do now? It's 10 o'clock, what are we supposed to be doing, as opposed to like one group that we worked with, not in Kate's company, but another company, they said the HR people really want to do action learning, but they said, well, where's the scripted guidebook and participant materials that tell them what objectives they're going to have for each session and what they're going to get out of it, and so there's a lot of shift in mindset that needs to happen. And on the other hand, you can only help people where they're at. So talking a lot about it doesn't help either, because people get stone deaf to it. So you would think in graduate school, for example, where I'm at right now in a school of education, that people would understand learning. I'm in an adult learning program, et cetera. But even in graduate school, people have been shaped by their prior industrial age experiences where the bells rang and they were tested, and we're increasingly doing that. So in fact, it does require this notion, I call it scaffolding, of kind of building learning in. And just one final point, to Kate's perspective, Yuri and I and his group, we did a series of interviews a number of years ago on strategic organizational learning, and one of the quotes from one of the people we talked to, always rings in my ears. He said, "We never use the L word here." So we talk to people about goals and objectives and what turns them on and what excites them, and the learning happens, but if we talk to them about learning, they think of it as grade school or as what they had to go through, school experiences, and it becomes a block. And so we want people to learn, but we don't ever call it learning.
That's a very good question. Thank you. I know that Peter wants to ask another question, then I'll ask you, because he wants to rebut your questioning.
Oh, okay.
Questioning technique.
This is not new, Yuri.
Are you sure you want him?
I worked once for a man who was a great believer in the potential, what we call it a potential contribution of a sophisticated barbarian, the guy who comes in from the outside without a priori assumptions and looks around and says, looks to me like that emperor ain't wearing no clothes. So I'm not a sophisticated, but I am a barbarian, so I'll just say something to Wanda that I said to Victoria last night about the talk that was made. I pay a lot of attention to words, and I noticed that in describing your programs, certainly last night, and I think maybe you used the same term, talked about the student delivering a solution. That, this is really following up on the first question that was made. I said to Victoria, but I am a mere husband, I should point out, that it is, if you think about the way the terms have evolved, pedagogy, which you described as what happens in the first year, that the roots of that word are leading the child. And it's interesting that education comes from educare, which means to lead out. This is a distinction that Bob Keegan makes. But that still implies a leader. And so what I like and what I think the term has evolved is learning, which, as this gentleman pointed out, is a thoroughly mutual process. While I have the microphone, I'll just make one other observation to Yuri and the man who spoke about the question about physics. It was interesting to me that you said that that Revens was a wave theorist, because wave theory...
That's not him. Don't care. Don't answer.
Wave theory... Is this me?
Houston calling.
Wave theory is the first area where absolute indeterminacy really entered the realm of physics and the natural world. Thinking about Schrödinger and Heisenberg and all that. So it's just an interesting thing that that Revens was so taken with an unfamiliar question and unfamiliar surroundings, because that is such a perfect description of quantum physics also. Anyway.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have two people back here. It's okay. Okay, and then Charlie. Okay, you want to wait? Ladies first that we come back?
Yeah.
I'll pass it over here. Thank you. Did you want a question too? No? Okay. Hi, Jess. Put it back. Thank you. This one.
Hi, I'm Jill Cantor. I'm an executive coach and action learning team coach, independent. And one thing that I found, I think, is that there's huge potential in learning by the participants being able to share with each other appropriately. And I'm just curious what experiences you've had in terms of supporting that in your different environments.
I can kick that one off. I've worked with a few organizations where people bring their individual leadership challenges, to the table. And I just find those kinds of engagements really great to support, because the first person who brings that challenge is taking a risk at being vulnerable, and they just put it out there, and the other people stay in inquiry to help them see different dimensions of it, and we do what we do in action learning, and you see that person, when the powerful question is asked, you see the insights coming, and you see the reaction that prompts in the person who asked the powerful question, like, wow, I can be of service to this person. And then this really cool thing happens where almost everybody around the table gets invested in that same problem. And the next time you come together, they say, how are you doing? Like, what happened? And we're not just being accountability, partners for them, but we really care. And people begin to see that. And so this one organization I'm working with now, they are in a 2-year-long leader development program, and they introduced action learning in year 1 with these kind of peer learning circles where they use individual challenges. Year 2 now, they are working in the same small groups. They're working an organizational challenge. And so what I'm really trying to pay attention to is what impact does that year-long investment of really getting to know each other and get invested in each other's issues, what impact is that going to have on their ability to wrestle the big monster of the organizational challenge? And it's remarkable because some people start with a work-related challenge, but many of the people that I supported brought in issues they were dealing with in their family or in their personal life, and you just see this real openness begin to happen that is remarkable. That's right.
Yeah, so we have two different programs that employ some of the tenets of action learning, and Judy's helped us to develop an approach for our next level down where they bring their individual, they're not personal problems, they are business, but they're their own real work problems, and a rigorous process that allows them to get that kind of questioning from their peers that follow them through the 9-month-long program together. So they're invested in helping each other to be successful, which culminates in the final, here's what my project is all about. But it is that notion of the cycle that Victoria presented up here on the board is exactly what we've implemented with this group of people. They are so bonded by the end of the time, and I think that's the other advantage that businesses get, so that we now have a group of people who have a secret handshake out in the organization, who are there when I need to go do an audit down in Brazil. I've got a buddy down there now who really makes a difference for me in terms of the business. So there are some less quantifiable but really powerful cultural elements that kind of work really brings as they help one another to solve business problems.
Victoria, did you want to make a comment?
Well, just ditto. I mean, basically, we have a program at Teachers College, which is of school leaders. It's called the Confellows Program, and it's experienced school leaders, and it's built around that model. You know, they come together like once every 6 weeks or whatever, and it's mostly the value of being able to talk to one another because they can't in a lot of other circumstances, and it's just an amazing experience. So I just think that's a very powerful kind of thing.
Thank you very much. And we have another question from the table.
My name is Sinead O'Flanagan, and I'm with Vanda and her team at the Leadership Lab. And so I have a comment to make and then a question. And first is in relation to this bringing the student expectations and the sponsor or host expectations together. One of the things that we developed in the lab was a workshop event in September where we invite the hosts to participate in that. And that has become very popular with the hosts in the last couple of years. But it grew out of the feedback that we were getting from the hosts, which was, you know, if only we knew what the student were going to do when they got on site, we'd have prepared better. But I was 2 people away from the person who set up the project, so I had no idea. So we offered the companies the option of sending somebody to this workshop, and they learn a lot from that. So I think that's a first step. But I do think there's a long way to go, and I guess my question is to the rest of the panel on that. You know, what I find is they still have a disconnect between the people who come here and other people who are in the organization who don't understand what's going on. So that secret handshake hasn't quite made it round, especially in the larger organizations. And we're still looking at how can you do that more effectively? Because the next year we go back to those companies, we know the people we have the handshake with, but they have such a big job to do to connect with others. And so we're still trying to figure that bit out. I'm curious if anybody has thought or figured out some ways of doing that.
I have a question for you. So when you think about that, do you have a notion about what gets in the way of them being able to have those relationships more broadly, to talk about and help people to understand what they're trying to do? Do you have a notion about what the root causes might be for that?
There's a number of them. Sometimes it's the goals of the organization are very clear to the people there, and they can't quite see what the learning is for the organization. So to Vanda's earlier point, you know, there's a learning element of what the students bring to the organization, and then there's the delivery. You know, we're going to do a strategy report and give it to the company. But sometimes they remember what the deliverable was that the students had, and others remember the learning that came from it. And what I find is that those who remember the learnings, that's the handshake. You know, look at all the things that the organization learned. But those who are still focused on the deliverable within the company are looking at, well, what can the students add this year? So that's sometimes where the disconnect happens.
We have Chuck first, and then we bring it back to you. Would you like to reply to that?
I mean, I just would say partly it's critical mass, which I know it's a struggle because this is out there in the literature, because action learning in the British version in particular in the literature, it says, you know, it doesn't, There's a trend towards focus on individual development, which is great, but it's the tension between the individual and the organization and the system where you get the real payoff. And yet it is consistently a challenge, to get that. And part of it, I think, is critical mass. But CCL has been doing some work around this in terms of building communities of different agencies working on common community problems. And they've created a second level of mechanism, which is a kind of a group that moves between the groups and the organization. And you might find, talk to people at CCL about what they're learning about that, because I think it is a big challenge.
Can I just ask one question in reference to that? What I'm missing out of this is the conversation with the sponsor. What are the obstacles to just go and talk to them about this and explain the alignment? I missed the organizational piece.
Oh, we do have the conversations, but the handoffs become the big challenge within the organization. So we set up the conversation, and we sometimes have those at frequent intervals. But when a team is going out to a large organization, the team is handed off to somebody else to manage them in a different department or in a different area. And we're also working across boundaries. So they're going out to maybe another department, another supplier. And so the handoffs are there's quite a number of handoffs.
Yes, so that's what I'm thinking of. Brevins, when you talked about how they did their experiment with companies and finding sponsors, you used to say it affected at least 15 to 20 people per company. So your constituency is therefore larger than you had imagined, right? That's the issue. And sensitizing them and getting them aligned is the issue, essentially. So you started with these workshops and getting them to understand. But have you touched all the key stakeholders in each company?
No, because that's often part of the project. So the students are looking at who are the other stakeholders involved, and that's part of what we teach them about, is how do you engage with the stakeholders. So at the start of the project, we don't know all the stakeholders. We try and touch on those that we do. That's part of what they're learning.
I see, so that's clear in my mind. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Chuck, you had a question?
So one of the things I've taken away from experience with Action Learning is the great power of the peer coaching. I mean, the peers just absolutely, I would say that peer coaching is far more effective than individual coaching if you're doing it right. And people see that. I think we have a huge opportunity to really spread the culture of peer coaching throughout organizations by having them experience it and then use it. The challenge that and the question is, how do we get this dispersed virally throughout the organization? I haven't tried this, but the only thing I have come up with is, as part of these leadership development programs, we actually ask people to go out and convene their own Action Learning group after they've been in their organization, and kind of just make that a part of the requirement and a reflection paper on that. But I'm wondering if anyone has had experience with kind of virally spreading Action Learning beyond the context of the leadership development program or the solution of a big corporate challenge. Because the only story I'm aware of is Kieran Beer, who had a huge challenge and basically over a week cascaded Action Learning teams throughout the organization to get their quest was getting to be #1 again. And in 3 weeks, they had like several hundred people doing Action Learning. But it was only for a short time. And did they get peer coaching? Did they get coaching competence out of that? I'm skeptical. But what other ideas do people have as how to spread it?
I have an example.
Yeah.
So a member of the executive program. So one of the things we do is we use members of our executive program to actually coach people in the Next Level Down program. A member of the executive program was so taken with this whole learning thought. He's a member of a large operational organization, so supply chain, quality, logistics, and they had a year-long approach that he initiated where each of the groups had to come up with an Action Learning project and had people from the executive program coaching those projects, and ended up at the end of the year at the global operations meeting actually presenting out what they had learned to the organization. So it's David Helsall and so that's how he spawned it, that he got his senior leader to buy into it. But in addition to that, he then moved to a new organization. He moved to another business unit to be the head of manufacturing, global operations manufacturing overall around the world. And as soon as he got the new job, he called me immediately and said, and I'm the head of diversity and inclusion. And he said, Kate, we need a diversity, inclusion, action learning project down here. And we are today using one of our coaches, and he's gone. He's actually left the company at this point. And we've started a grounds up action learning project around how do you really begin to struggle with this issue of diversity in an organization, a factory that has 30 languages, people from all over the world, people at all levels of the organization in a fear-based culture. And it's living on its own at this point. I do have a coach that's working with them, but they're driving it. So an isolated example, but a powerful one.
I guess my experience kind of reinforces that because, when you're trying to lead change, we have our structure, we have our programs, we have these things, but to really build that momentum, it's find the people who get it, go where the energy is, and find the people who will proselytize by living it. So I guess part of the answer to my own dilemma is how can we bring action learning into organizations as a way of being rather than as a labeled thing we do, what the inquiry, the reflection, how does that just become part of our DNA? Going where the energy is can help spread it, I think.
We'll line up questions now. Mrs. Kozlowski first,
independent consultant, having worked in the federal government for a long time, the last of which was with Veterans Affairs and in the Veterans Health Administration. I'm also a doctoral candidate at Teachers College in adult learning. And Yuri asked me to share a comment I made. One of the things I've become fascinated with is a work surrounding physicists. And there's an ethnographic study that was done on big science. She looked at lab biologists, wet biologists who deal with data, and she spent time looking at high particle physicists, people involved in CERN. And what is striking about the description of what they do and how they work together is that they talk about not being able to rely on data, the importance of keeping notes on what they're thinking as they're looking at the data, getting information about the history of the equipment that they're dealing with because they get repairs that might affect their observations. And they also talk about how they have to talk with other physicists who are observing, who are working with the same data in the same machines, perhaps in different locations. And as you look at what they're talking about, it is a highly reflective culture. They talk about not working at a situation where you're just staring at a screen. You're in an open space where you can share your observations in the moment as you're looking at the data. It's fascinating work, and it's very pertinent, because here's a big scientist using reflective language, articles being, and shared leadership, and it's into it, articles being written by 300 people with no lead author, and being proud of that in their culture. Fascinating work. Having worked in a culture where I understand the fear of taking risks and getting feedback, and I understand the culture totally, and also understanding that when you talk about learning, you really can't talk about, you don't talk about learning, you just have to do it. So here you are, and I face this dilemma as I'm working with people and listening to all of you. You get people who you bring in, they look at the circle and they're saying, what in heaven's name is going on? They go through this experience with you, and then they have to go back.
Yeah. Yes.
How do you help them with the transition to prepare them for what will happen when they go out to the regular environments? It's something that I struggle with, because as I deal with some of the people I deal with, I know the culture they're going back to is not going to be the same as in this group that lasted for a while. It could be highly political in a lot of different ways. They're going to be in a totally different, unsupported space. So how do we help with the transition? Maybe it's a so what, so how do you know that this practice will continue when they leave you?
I remember the study that we did. I keep going back to that study, but there was just so many really interesting things that were said. And one of them was you can't actually do action learning in the classroom and expect it to, and then go back into transfers. So what we have to do is to figure out how to build it right there. How do you get people skilled enough so that when these things happen, they start doing it there, as opposed to we do it over here and then we have to transfer it back there. So that's kind of one of my dilemmas, which is one of the reasons why I like the action learning conversation thing, but there's a lot more to it than that. But I think that is part of the answer, is we have to do it there. We have to do it in the work environment so that we're not having to then force people to do something that is, they're not able to do.
So to the origins of that question too, which is, I'm a little bit puzzled by the fact that you're trying to influence the business school to be different in terms of learning approaches before they get to you. And I think you tried this at Columbia, didn't you?
We tried very early on. We're part of that early history where we learned about this stuff, and we were convening meetings to talk to people about action learning, and no way, Jose, because it wasn't in their motivated self-interest to do it. And they were also afraid about being in the room with other organizations and having are their secrets being stolen, and all this kind of stuff. So it was really GE broke the back of it. When they started doing it, because it was GE, everybody wanted to do it. But I think it's a question of, in developmental work, we talk about challenge and support. So how do you challenge, like you're doing, you're challenging. And what kind of support do you need to provide so that it's not such a stretch that people fall in the chasm and never get out of it? So I don't know.
So you've been trying, but not with great results. Is that
At
correct?
the business school at Columbia, they do action learning, but as has often been commented on, a lot of executive education at business schools do action learning, quote unquote, but it isn't necessarily what people in this room are talking about. They have people work on projects, and they don't provide often a lot of support. They expect that they will learn, but nobody pays much attention to what they're doing, how they're doing it, how to support it. So at least that's been my experience and what I read, and when I talk to people, that's what they say often happens.
That's one of the reasons why I never use the word projects.
Right.
Never, because it has
Yeah.
associations.
Right,
with another
right,
world, yeah.
right.
Thank you for that. We have 2 questions on this side. I haven't forgotten. First, we'll start with you, please.
Thank you. My name's Michelle Bleiberg. I think I'm in the minority, being from the corporate world here. And I was thinking about the conversation earlier about host expectations. And I've been running, I think, one of the largest action learning initiatives over the last 7 years internally. And I realized something from the conversation here. It's interesting to me that people that are working with organizations are thinking about the host expectations. Something I didn't expect to be dealing with was that we were disappointed in the skills of the sponsors. So from my perspective, they were my hosts. And a lot of what we learned is that we started off looking for the right project, and we realized what had a lot of success with the project or not was the skill of the sponsors. And I'm wondering if other groups that do action learning have found this and how they might have addressed it, because it seems so simple, but not only were senior leaders not necessarily open to question things, the lack of project management skills, the lack of ability to give honest feedback to the teams, so much of the team's success had to do with the skill of the sponsor. We quickly learned that repeat offender projects were the best, and we actually gave more projects to sponsors that were very good. We also analyzed, after doing hundreds of projects, which sponsors were the best from the students' employee perspectives. And this may just be coincidence, they were almost all, not entirely, senior women leaders. And again, I wasn't doing a scientific study, I wasn't looking for this at all, but they found that they were more open to getting the feedback as well as giving the feedback. Again, we did have many men sponsors that were fantastic and would hate to hear me say this. But what we ended up doing was, we used to do a sponsor orientation, and we ended up sneaking in training for sponsors and inviting former sponsors to come and share with new sponsors how important it was that they, and here I felt like I was doing a project management 101, think through the problem clearly. Don't change your mind in the middle. Give open and direct feedback. And so it's just become a whole part of action learning that I hadn't planned on, was actually either the selection of the sponsor or the training of the sponsor. So I know you're all talking about it in terms of host organization, but being a host organization, I'm curious if that is emerging or becoming part of what's gone into action learning, because it's not in a lot of the literature or direction of action learning typically. Thank you.
Yeah, I can totally echo that. In my experience, I think it's the problem owner is a special kind of person and is pivotal to the experience. Do they bring enthusiasm for the approach? Do they have the business acumen that you want the team to aspire to and learn? Are they holding them to certain standards of rigor in their thinking and their analysis? And are they aligned with their executives? Like, do they share the same brain in a way in terms of what they'll expect? And are they the one asking the learning questions and the leadership questions at the same time? I think your sponsor is a really special person, and I'd love to hear more about what you've learned.
We absolutely resonate with exactly the same issues as I think Sinead already pointed to. One of the things we've just started that seems to be making a really big difference, and we're just beginning to have the opportunity to do it, is to recruit, as our sponsors or hosts, former graduates of our program. So when we have a lot of mid-career students who take our course, after 3 or 4 years, they're in positions where they come back to us and say, we'd love to do a project. And those are the perfect sponsor hosts because they fully understand the process, what's involved. And we've had 2 or 3 such projects, and they've just been fabulous. Now, to the extent that that's possible, it's very small, it's very incremental, but that is a way you can, we're trying now, Jason mentioned earlier, build an alumni network. We're actively trying to both be support, so in a way to help them do the transition. I think there was a question about transitions. So if we can create an alumni network, that they can support each other in their transitions into whatever organizations they end up in, but also then to continue collaborating with us at Sloan to be part of the Action Learning program here.
So. We actually do the same thing internally, so when people that go through the project, they themselves get promoted. And to, I think the question earlier, to me, that's how I've seen the cascade of Action Learning be most effective. Thank you.
It's almost like Demosthenes trying to find the honest man. We have 4 more questions to go, if you don't mind. We'll be a little bit over time, but I'm sure you appreciate the questions, please.
Joanne Yates from Sloan. And I just want to highlight the difference that I'm hearing here between those of you who are working in corporations and the business school setting where you have a team of maybe 4 students who are on average 28 years old. They're each from a different background. They're working as a team to deliver some value, and using that word deliver again, they have to deliver some value to the firm who their host firm, because otherwise the host firms won't take them. So the firms are not they don't have to do it. They're not part of the Action Learning program. We have to convince them to do it. So, we have to deliver some value. That's how they would put it in order for us to get access to them. And then our teams, we have these teams of these, as Peter said last night, the more diverse the teams are, the better, but they're not individually sitting there and giving feedback to each other as individuals. They're working as a team to produce some learning and outcome. At the same time, though, they are trying to promote their own self-learning. One of the mechanisms some of our lab courses use, and I don't think LLab do, you use the journals for your reflection, which is a more private, personal, between the teacher and the student. But one of the things we've done more of late is had students on these teams blog during their projects while they're, overseas in Cambodia or wherever they are doing their project, blogging as they go. And that's available not just to their own team, not just to their teacher who does grade it as a reflection, but to a broader audience, which sort of ups the ante on them in a sense. With keeping in mind that there is obviously a big difference between the kinds of things our students are doing and the kinds of things the corporate ones could do. I wondered if you had any comment about that blogging it's the writing. Who was it that talked about the importance of writing?
To help you with thinking.
Yeah, right. And, they're writing this as they go in the middle of the project and at the end. They do a reflection paper at the very end, but they do all this blogging through it, which is nice. Is there anything comparable in your setting?
Yeah, so we've built social media in as a primary element. We have an internal social networking site, and we've actually built it in as a very integral part of each of our programs. And the project teams actually have a space within our space on the social networking site where they do their collaboration. So it reinforces that, as well as encouraging people to share their thinking, because our people are from around the world when they're on our teams. They're very diverse. They can be from Asia and California, so no time zones that are really even compatible in a lot of cases. So that they have to figure out new ways and different ways to communicate with one another.
Is it going out beyond the specific team to a broader audience?
It's a great question, and we haven't cracked that nut yet. But because it is really tough to get people to engage in that kind of a way with something that's really not relevant to them in their mind, whether it's relevant or not, which we think it is. Yeah.
For the alumni of those programs, they continue.
Right, that's our vision.
And they take it out to everyone else.
Yeah, that's our vision.
We have 3 more questions. Thank you for that.
Hi. My name is Paul Friga, a faculty member from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm a traditional consultant turned academic, and I think I'm squarely in the American model from Yuri's presentation, and we've had conversation about that. So I'm trying to make sense of lots of the alternative theory as to why we should change just really doing a project and then adding some of these concepts during the process rather than restructuring it to be a kind of unusual learning experience we have to explain to the client. So I'm kind of getting my arms around that, but I think it sounds driven probably from some theory that doing a regular project where you're solving it as a team and then using some time to give feedback to each other and learn and reflect, and something's not working, I guess. There must be some reason why that doesn't work well. So the situation is, to kind of compare these models to figure out, as I'm listening, I'm thinking, what should I change in our program, which is very much do a 3-month project, use a hypothesis-driven approach, like a consulting project, based on past experience in McKinsey and other firms. But I'm wondering, how do we measure outcomes for this? How do we know when these kind of changes that we're doing that are unusual in a different setting are better than something else? So that's my direct question to you. How do you measure the outcomes related to learning as you go about this?
I can start that. We actually formally measure. So with the help again of Victoria and Judy and Karen Watkins, we do 6-month and a year later follow-ups with participants and their managers and people who work for them, and ask critical questions, critical incident questions, to understand what kind of changes have happened. And they're inspiring. They're transformational. They're remarkable. And you don't get that. And we're an OpEx culture, so I can tell you, you don't get that in project teams because they don't have the elements. So in a project team, so much of it is focused on the rigor around the work that you're doing and not on the personal, the learning, the organizational impact. And this process allows you to do those things that help people to individually, the team, and impacting ultimately the organization change in different ways. It's not a right or a wrong, or one's better, but one is profoundly different. Well, that's my dilemma that I presented to you earlier, because my organization would like to just do the straight projects and not do the other. And it's how do you balance those things? And it is truly a balance, and sometimes it's such a fine line of a balance between what you give and what you don't give in order to help people, because what you're trying to do is get people to help themselves. So you don't give them the lists, the backgrounders, the information, but you have to meet them where they are at the same time, as Victoria said, which is the pain we have, because they aren't very far along the spectrum. So that team training you talked about is right on, because they don't have that skill, so they can't be effective to do that greater learning without it. So that's something we have to give them that the purest action learning person might not do.
I would just add that, it partly depends on, what it is you're hoping to get out of it, and whether the outcome that you're looking to get is incremental and improving on what's in place versus it's not going to work. We were talking from the Wharton School about the question of, it may be uncomfortable and they may not like it, but if they're in a VUCA world, a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, and they're going to run off the cliff and kill themselves if they don't figure out a different way of doing it, they may not like what they're going through, and they may not like you, but you got to help them get there, because otherwise you're just aiding and abetting running off the cliff and going where you're. So I think there's a gamut, and I am of the view that you do have to start with people where they're at. But if you want to get them someplace else, you don't. It's like you didn't get Eastern European countries all of a sudden to be capitalist overnight, but you try to work with where they were at and help them move forward in some way. So that's my view: is you do have to understand the outcomes you want, and then you got to pitch it the way you want it, to get there.
That's why some people say action learning is an art.
Yeah. Right.
We have 2 more questions, please. First, you, if you would mind. Thank you.
Song Park from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. So from the institution I come from, you might guess I might be the least acquainted person with the concept of action learning. And I'm just a fresh starter in learning all this. So 2 questions I bring to you has to do with me trying to learn the concept better. First, we have been hearing the importance of tackling unfamiliar problem in unfamiliar territory on a couple of different occasions. But then I also have been hearing during this session how hosts are being, or the relationship with the hosts are being, trying to be managed and prescribed in a certain way. So if we, on the one hand, we emphasize the importance of unfamiliarity in all of this, but then we try to manage what the hosting environment would be, then how do we then back manage the unfamiliarity aspect of the whole experience? That's my first question. And then the second is, this is triggered by another question here. How do we help the trained to sustain practicing the action learning after they've gone through the training? My take on that would be, what if we clarify the question of the purpose in the whole experience? Wouldn't meaningful purpose the learned individual pursues through the rest of the life, just put him, keep practicing it? So my question would be, in that regards, would be, what would be the major purpose each of you would be striving to impart as you train, either executives or your students?
Thank you. Very light questions.
Well, I could start. So with respect to the unfamiliarity, I think it's a great question or point. I guess for us, the purpose is first with the students. I mean, that's our primary objective here, is to help the students learn. So putting the students in these host organizations is for them a very unfamiliar territory, and they are working in very unfamiliar ways in these very diverse teams with a set of tools that are very unfamiliar to them. So I think the purpose of the unfamiliarity is very much met with respect to our students. You're right, though, that the host, and to the extent that we try and manage it so that it has all the, it's a project that works, that doesn't collapse, that actually has people ready and willing to help and support and so on, means that we do have to do some, prescription is a bit strong, but certainly managing and negotiating, navigating. So you're right that makes it less of an unfamiliar territory for the hosts. What we hope, though, is what students do bring when they get there is a process that engages the host team or group, that gets them to do things in somewhat unfamiliar ways, gets them out of their routine ways, habitual ways of interacting with each other, for example, or methods of inquiry that really help them to ask different questions. One of our hosts, we were just looking at some of the sponsor feedback, said it really helped us to have different conversations. So when our hosts can have that and there's an outcome, I mean, we really feel that the team has managed to shift some things a little bit. So in that, it works really well, then the host does experience some unfamiliarity, even though they're in the same context. So I think that's that works. It doesn't always work that way, but yeah. Your second, well, let me hand it off while I think about your second question.
That would require some thought. It's a beautiful question. So what purpose do I hope to help people derive when they're engaged in action learning? I think it really kind of comes down to the purpose of helping people see possibility. Just possibility for anything that's whatever urge they have in their lives, whether it's aligning with your purpose, more creative problem solving, possibility of expanding relationships and seeing what can be done with other people, but I just boil it down to possibility.
Kathy, would you like to say something? Or Victoria?
I would just say that, I think part of the answer to that question is who are we working with and what is their purpose? Because action learning is driven by the individual's self-interest and motivation, and so it's not like what we want for them is what do they want for themselves and how can we support that process. So I think it varies. My own personal goals is I do see these interactive kind of levels that I think you had on your slide, the notion of that the individual is nested in the groups are nested in a larger organization, which is nested in society. And so my preference is to work also at the highest possible level. But people aren't always there, and the organization doesn't want them to be there, or they might lose their job if they are. So, the question of how do you negotiate those things, I think, is of interest. And there's also a very interesting book that Jay Conger wrote a number of years ago with Benjamin, in which they looked at a lot of action learning programs and they said, it differs partly by the purpose, and some purposes are for skill development and capability development, some purposes are for socializing people in one way or another, and other purposes are for changing the organization, and that you have to think about what does it have to look like if you're doing those different kinds of things? What mix of those things where's your primary focus? So that's how I would answer that question.
Wanda, would you like to, now that you've had a chance to think about it?
I think it's really sort of a blend, actually, I would say, of that. I think our goal very much is to help the students to think about their purpose. So it's about helping them see possibilities, but it is really about supporting them in whatever their future journey is, because we're in a position here to really, in a way, we're preparing these students to go out in the world. And we always sort of give they're too much a little bit on the treadmill of just trying to do courses. So we really hope that our class can serve a sort of a stopping and pausing to really reflect on why am I here and what do I want to create in my life. And so we try and give them tools and skills. So at the end of the day, through the various experiences and transformations that we hope they can go through, that they begin to make that real in their lives. So.
Thank you very much. We have one final question. Kathy, did you want to add something? You okay? Okay. Please.
Thank you for allowing me to ask this question. I feel under pressure to get it out quick. My name is Mark Harden. I'm the dean of a graduate seminary school that same as Dr. Park. My question has to do with the more so the expectation framing as it relates to the student, and I'll try to just say what's on my mind and let you respond to it without trying to formalize a question. But this thing of motivation to me appears to be very much tied to, expectation tied to motivation. The last comment really hit the point. And then also your illustration of a process you went through where there's reframing. And in the reframing, the way I think of reframing is we're not asking individuals to give up their value, because regardless of how people learn, they're value-laden processes that are dear to the individual. And I view that as what we try to do in a reframing process, is to get them to kind of see things differently. Milton Rokeesh out of Michigan State kind of got at that terminal versus instrumental values. And I see this action learning as kind of focusing on how can we get individuals to see that there's another way to learn. And it doesn't necessarily displace the other way of learning. It actually makes them bicultural, in my view. And I think that if we push the buttons that they are deeply where their values lie, which is in this old way, we can motivate and at least reframing things with students coming into Sloan with this sort of new weird thing, kind of saying that we're not saying that the way you've learned or the way you learn in your past is irrelevant. We're just showing you a different way. It's a good way to build motivation. And I would imagine in a business context, you're dealing with the same thing. If you try to say that we're trying to change the way you think and the way you operate totally in an organization, I mean, that's an intergalactic approach to change. But if you say we want to offer you some tools and some new ways of thinking and reframing that will complement the way you do, you would much more stronger selling point. Thank you for my time.
And that's a very eloquent way of ending. Thank you very much. Unless there's an extra comment that you'd like to make, then I will ask you a question. Has this questioning and this discussion helped you clarify your dilemmas today?
I think it's gotten new insight for me and also fresh energy, you know, because in education we actually end up being very isolated, and you know, we don't get as many opportunities to talk with one another about things like this that are so important. So for me, I'm leaving freshly energized and with renewed commitment to try to, you know, to work on this dilemma. So that's where I'm at, and I've gotten some new insights from listening to people and talking to people.
Thank you.
Two things I'd say. Listening to you this morning was very helpful for me. Just the depth of insight, but also there's lots of different ways to do this. And you know, and I felt guilty about trying to stuff too many rocks in the sack. and it gave me the, you know, I have to, the balance is important, but I have to do what I have to do to help people where they are, to meet them where they are. And just having the audience, so there is a difference in the way you think about things and the way you speak about things when you're doing it in this kind of a group setting. So it helps to clarify sometimes what you're really asking or trying to say. So that's always very helpful. So I thank you all very much for that.
For me, it's been interesting to hear the academic perspective. The context is different. The challenges are similar. I feel like I'm here with my people. You know, this is really good. And it occurred to me somewhere in the middle of our conversation, wow, I wonder if we all got together. There are a lot of people out there who know the secret handshake. And we talk about sustaining action learning as a way of being. You know, we need to gather. We need to talk more and realize the power that we have to energize that secret handshake group at school. I like that.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Well, similarly, I think there have been some interesting insights that we will certainly take on board in terms of how to manage and work with these expectations. I like the idea of biculturalism. I think that's exactly right. I also think it's wonderful to be able to share a dilemma that we've been wrestling with and sort of been and seeing nods of recognition around the room and feeling that this really is a shared issue, that we all, it's not just us who haven't figured out how to do it. It really is a shared problem that many people are engaging with. And so that's also quite reassuring. So that's been great.
Very good. I guess on your behalf, I'd like to thank the panelists for their wisdom and their insights into this lecture. Thank you.